My mother-in-law had no idea that I was the one paying the $7,500 monthly rent for her house. She called me a freeloader, threw my bags out onto the road, and shoved me out of the house. My husband? He just stood there and watched. She thought she was removing a burden. She had no idea she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Just a few weeks later, she got a surprise she never saw coming. My name is Julia, and for as long as I can remember, I've been a fixer. In my professional life as a senior software architect, that means I spend my days staring at complex lines of code, hunting down the one tiny glitch that's threatening to crash an entire system. I'm the one they call when the stakes are high and the clock is ticking. I thought that skill set made me a good wife. I thought that by anticipating every problem and quietly smoothing over every rough edge, I was building a fortress around my marriage. I never realized that while I was busy debugging our life, I was actually installing a virus that would eventually delete everything I cared about. When you're a fixer, you become invisible. People stop noticing the effort once the results become a given. They see the $7,500 a month Hamptons rental with its cedar shingles and salt air breeze. They see the high-end groceries in the sub-zero fridge, and they see the stability. They don't see the woman behind the monitor at 3 a.m., eyes stinging from blue light, taking on a third consulting contract just to make sure the family image stays intact. I thought I was protecting Thomas's dignity. I thought I was being a silent benefactor to a family that just needed a little help getting back on their feet. But I was wrong. I wasn't being a partner. I was being a ghostwriter for a story where everyone else got the credit, and I was just the fine print they didn't bother to read. The arrangement started 2 years ago, the day Thomas sat me down in our old apartment, his face pale, and told me his VP position had been restructured. He was devastated. His identity was tied to that title, and more importantly, his mother's pride was tied to his success. Beatrice is the kind of woman who treats social status like a religion. To her, a man without a high-powered title is a man who doesn't exist. "Don't tell her, Julia," Thomas had pleaded. "I'll find something else in a month. Just let her think things are fine. If she knows I failed, I'll never hear the end of it." So I did what a fixer does. I protected him. I suggested we move to the Hamptons, a place Beatrice had always dreamed of living. I told her the move was because of Thomas's promotion. I took on the burden of a $7,500 monthly rent, a figure that would make most people's eyes water, but I told myself it was an investment in our future. To cover it, I signed on with 2 extra startup firms as a consultant. My day started at 5 a.m. with European clients and ended at midnight with West Coast deployments. Living with Beatrice was like living with a poisoned silk ribbon. She moved into our guest wing and immediately began curating our lives. Every morning, she'd swish into my home office, the one room where I was actually generating the wealth she lived on, and sigh. "Still cooped up in here, Julia?" she'd ask, trailing a manicured finger over my monitors. It's such a shame. A woman should be out in the garden or at the tennis club. But I suppose when you don't have Thomas's natural career trajectory, you have to grind away at those little numbers just to feel useful. I would just force a smile and go back to my code. I paid for her $200 weekly organic grocery hauls. I paid for her Silver Sage Wellness memberships. I even paid for the $400 highlights in her hair. She would sit on my Italian leather sofa, sipping Pinot Grigio that cost $80 a bottle, bought with my money, and tell her friends on the phone how blessed she was that her son provided such a stately life for his wife. Thomas became a ghost. He spent his days networking at the golf course, on my dime, while I developed a permanent knot between my shoulder blades. I was exhausted, depleted, and physically vibrating from caffeine and stress. I was holding up the sky for them, and they were complaining about the shade. I thought Thomas saw my sacrifice. I thought he was the one person who knew that every luxury Beatrice flaunted was a piece of my soul I'd traded for a paycheck. I didn't realize he wasn't grateful. He was just comfortable. And comfort makes people forget who's actually keeping them warm. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of expensive truffle oil and Beatrice's suffocating perfume. It was a Sunday brunch, The kind where everything looks perfect on Instagram but feels like a funeral in person. I was staring at my coffee, my head throbbing from a 4-eat server migration, when Beatrice suddenly tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon. "I have an announcement," she said, her voice dripping with that faux regal tone she saved for her grand visions. She pulled a glossy, spiral-bound folder from her lap and slid it across the table. On the cover, in gold-embossed letters, it read, "The Beatrice Manor Wellness Retreat." I frowned, flipping through pages of high-res photos of our house. My house. "What is this, Beatrice?" "It's a business plan, dear. Thomas and I have been discussing it," she said, flashing a shark-like smile. "This house is far too grand for just the three of us, especially with one person constantly shut away in a dark room staring at code. We've decided to convert the East Wing, starting with your office, into a luxury Airbnb suite. It will be the flagship for my retreat business." I felt the blood drain from my face. "My office? Beatrice, that's where I work. That's where the income comes from." She laughed, a sharp, cold sound. "Income? Julia, let's be realistic. Your little freelance projects are pocket change compared to what this brand will build. Thomas is the provider here, and it's time we stop indulging your hobby at the expense of his estate. Mark needs a partner who supports his legacy, not a tenant who takes up prime real estate." I felt a cold shiver of terror. I turned to Thomas, waiting for the explosion, waiting for him to stand up and say, "Mom, stop. Julia pays for every brick of this house. She's the reason you aren't in a studio apartment." But Thomas didn't look up. He carefully cut a piece of smoked salmon, his eyes fixed on his plate. "Mom's right, Jules," he muttered, his voice weak and pathetic. "The market is shifting. We need more liquid cash for the retreat. Maybe you could stay at your sister's place in the city for a few months, just until we get the first few 5-star reviews. It's for the family." "For the family?" I whispered. Beatrice stood up, her eyes glinting with triumph. "I've already listed the suite online. The first guests arrive on the 1st of next month. I've moved your computers into the garage. I'll expect your keys on the counter by tomorrow morning." I looked at the man I had spent 2 years protecting, and for the first time, I didn't see a husband. I saw a parasite. The drive to the hotel was the quietest 30 minutes of my life. I didn't scream, I didn't honk the horn, I didn't even cry. There is a specific kind of silence that happens when the fixer finally realizes that the system isn't just glitched, it's fundamentally broken beyond repair. As I pulled into the Marriott parking lot, I watched the sunset over the horizon and felt a strange, icy clarity settle over me. For 2 years, I had been the firewall protecting Thomas and Beatrice from the reality of their own incompetence. I had worked myself into the ground so they could play act as Hampton's royalty. And their response? To toss me out like an expired subscription the second they thought they found a better deal. I checked into a suite, sat at the small desk, and opened my laptop. My hands weren't shaking anymore. In the world of software, when a piece of code is too bloated, too buggy, and too demanding of your resources, you don't try to patch it anymore. You delete it. "Mark is the provider," Beatrice had said. "You're just a tenant," Thomas had implied. Fine. If I was just a tenant, then I had no obligation to maintain the property. If Thomas was the provider, then it was time for him to provide. I took a deep breath, the salt air finally smelling like freedom instead of a burden. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a technician about to perform a long overdue system wipe. I opened my email and began to draft the messages that would turn their wellness retreat into a ghost town. I didn't go for the jugular with a scream. I went for the infrastructure. In my world, you don't need to shout when you hold the administrative privileges. I called my landlord, Mr. Henderson. He had always liked me because my $7,500 wire transfer arrived 5 days early every month. I explained that due to a sudden relocation, I was invoking the diplomatic clause in my contract, a specific rider I'd insisted on because of my corporate status. Since I was the sole name on the lease and the only one who had cleared the background check, the contract lived and died with me. I told him the house would be vacated by the 1st. I logged into our joint accounts, the ones I funded and they spent. I didn't steal, I simply reclaimed. I moved my $15,000 emergency fund into a private high-yield account they couldn't touch. Then I systematically deactivated the authorized user cards. No more $80 Pinot Grigio. No more Silver Sage massages. The next time Beatrice tried to swiping for her organic truffles, that card was going to scream, declined. This was my favorite. In a house that large, everything is smart. The Nest thermostats, the high-speed fiber internet, the Sonos sound system, the water filtration, all of it was registered to my name and my credit card. I scheduled the service disconnections for the morning of the 1st. Beatrice's wellness retreat required 5-star amenities. I was leaving her with a beautiful, expensive, dark shell. I didn't block their numbers. Not yet. I wanted to see the logs. I kept the Ring camera active on my phone. I sat in my quiet hotel room, sipping a coffee I didn't have to hide, and watched the countdown. They thought they had evicted a roommate. They were about to find out they had evicted their entire life support system. 31 days later, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. I was standing in my new city condo, a sleek glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the skyline, when the Ring camera app sent an alert. I watched as Beatrice stood on the Hamptons porch, screaming at a group of confused tourists holding suitcases. Her Airbnb guests had arrived to a house with no lights, no running water, and a landlord standing there with 2 sheriff's deputies. An hour later, they were at my lobby. Beatrice looked like she had aged a decade. Her perfect hair was a mess, and her designer coat was wrinkled. Thomas was behind her, looking small and broken. When I went down to the lobby, Beatrice lunged toward me, not with an insult, but with a plea. "Julia, honey, there's been a mistake. The bank, the landlord, they said you canceled everything. Tell them it was a glitch. We have guests. We have a business." Thomas tried to grab my hand, his voice trembling. "Jules, please. I know I messed up, but we're a family. You can't let us go into a shelter. Just pay the back rent and we can fix this." I didn't let them pass the security desk. I simply handed Thomas a heavy manila envelope. "I'm done fixing things, Thomas," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "Inside, you'll find the divorce papers and an itemized invoice for the $180,000 I spent carrying you both for 2 years. I'm not a tenant, and I'm certainly not your benefactor anymore." I turned to Beatrice, who was gaping like a fish. "You told me the house was too big for someone who doesn't contribute. It looks like it's too big for you, too. Enjoy the motel." I walked back to the elevator without looking back. For the first time in years, the only life I had to debug was my own, and the code was finally perfect. I want to hear from you. At what point do you think Thomas crossed the line from a struggling husband to a willing accomplice? Or was Beatrice the only one truly at fault here? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I want to remind you that this story was a dramatization created specifically for societal awareness and education. I share these fictional scenarios to shine a light on the dark realities of financial abuse and family betrayal so that you can recognize the warning signs in your own life. Please do not repeat the negative behaviors or extreme actions shown in this story. I present these mistakes so you don't have to make them yourself. In the end, true justice isn't just about revenge, it's about having the courage to walk away from people who don't value you. If you found something meaningful in this story, subscribe and hit the bell icon to join me daily.